Hi. This is the Behringer PRO-1, an analog remake of the classic sequential PRO-1. With the same interface, internal oscillators and filters that are clones of the originals, and an interesting new paraphonic mode that doesn't exist in the original PRO-1. In this video, I'll take a brief look at how the PRO-1 compares to Behringer's existing monosynth lineup, then take an in-depth, beginner-friendly look at what PRO-1 can do, and then wrap up with some patch ideas and pros and cons. Let's get started. So the first thing you may ask yourself, and I know that I did, is how PRO-1 fits in with Behringer's ever-expanding line of small, low-cost monosynths. I've already reviewed and made in-depth tutorials about Model D, Neutron, Crave, and MS1. I no longer have any of them as they were all borrowed from friends or Behringer, so I can't show them here, but I'll link to those videos below. I've also got the K2 on loan coming soon, so ring the subscribe bell if you don't want to miss that one. So how does PRO-1 fit in with all this lineup? PRO-1 has two oscillators and an LFO. Some of these synths, like Crave and the MS1, have only one oscillator. Some of them have a more aggressive filter, like the K2, and some have a similar sounding filter, like the MS1. Some have a much more extensive patch bay, like the Neutron and Crave, and PRO-1 has fewer patch connections, but also has a simplified mod matrix interface which doesn't require patching. In terms of the sheer amount of features, Neutron is probably the king of the feature set with drive and analog delay and feature-rich control software, and yet PRO-1 has both an arpeggiator and sequencer, which Neutron does not, though its arpeggiator and sequencer requires an external keyboard, something that the Crave and MS1 don't. Of course, all those features aside, there's whatever nostalgic value you ascribe to owning a synth with the layout of an MS101, Model D, PRO-1, and so on, which I don't discount at all. So all of these things are things to think about as you explore whether any of these synths are right for you. Let's take a closer look at PRO-1. True to Sequential's original vintage PRO-1, the layout here is virtually identical. PRO-1 was a monosynth and this follows suit, so it's designed to play only one note at a time. However, the Behringer version has an additional duophonic switch and feature which doesn't exist in the original. Duophonic in this case means the ability to play each of the two oscillators at any pitch you like with a single keyboard. Right, so this is both oscillators playing at the same time, but if I play two notes, right, I get two different notes, each note assigned to a different oscillator. Now this is called duophonic or paraphonic because both oscillators still share the same filter envelope and VCA envelope, unlike a true polysynth. By the way, you can, if you want, chain multiple PRO-1s, though you would need to recreate the knob positions for each additional PRO-1, so maybe we'll wait for a polyphonic one, Behringer, at some point. Anyway, let's continue with the overview. Starting left to right, PRO-1 has an easy-to-use and simple mod matrix, though it is different than traditional mod matrices. We'll get to that later on. Then you've got two oscillators, an LFO, mixer and glide control, an arpeggiator and sequencer section, which, as I mentioned, requires a keyboard to be programmed. And on the right is the filter control section with a dedicated ADSR envelope for the filter, as well as an additional ADSR envelope for the amplifier or VCA. You've got a basic patch bay on the top and tuning and master volume on the right, as well as a MIDI input. On the back are MIDI through, USB for both MIDI and software control, and an on-off switch. Finally, for the overview, PRO-1 can be taken out of this case and mounted in a Eurorack case if you like, and this needs mentioning. You cannot save sound presets here, so it's best to know how to use it, which is what we'll get to right now. Okay, let's start with oscillators. You've got fine-tune control using this knob over a range of a bit more than an octave, and this applies to both oscillators. Then you've got octave control, 4 octaves up and down. Each of the oscillators has shape toggles. There's saw and square with variable pulse width for oscillator A, and then oscillator B has a saw and variable pulse width square or pulse as well as a triangle, and you can mix and match between these, right, to create more complex shapes. The oscillators sound good. You know, these are the 3340s. So they do the job right. Across the frequency range. Beyond that, each of the oscillators has an additional distinct features. For oscillator B, you can move it into low frequency mode, right? And then use that as both an audio rate modulator as well as a slow LFO, though there is, of course, an additional LFO on board. You can also disconnect oscillator B from the keyboard, right? So playing the keyboard won't impact it. This is useful when using it as an LFO, because you don't want playing up and down the keyboard to impact the LFO rate, as well as at higher rates to create a drone, right, that you can play alongside the first oscillator. Then oscillator A's special power is oscillator sync, which forces it to reset to the frequency of oscillator B and creates those typical oscillator sync sounds. For this to work well, the frequency of oscillator A needs to be above that of oscillator B. Right, and then you get these oscillator sync sounds. And this is obviously best when modulated, either with the envelopes or the LFO. We'll get to that in a bit. Let's keep moving on down right. The glide option lets you glide between notes. Right? And then it has a normal mode, which will always glide between notes. Right? Or an auto mode, which will only glide when you play legato, but won't glide when you play notes individually. Next up is the mixer, which gives you level control for each of the oscillators independently, right? As well as noise level. And you can replace the noise with any audio plugged into the external input. Continuing to the right is the filter module. This is a low-pass 24 dB per octave filter, so the cutoff frequency will rapidly cut off any harmonics above whatever it's set to, right? That's a low-pass filter, lets the low frequencies pass. Then resonance is a peak or emphasis at the cutoff point, right? This works, of course, not just on noise, right? So this is a filter sweep with no resonance. As you increase resonance, levels of the other harmonics go down, as is typical for this type of filter. You can start picking off the harmonics. Mentioned before, this filter has this sort of like squelchy character, similar to the MS-101 or the MS-1. And it will self-oscillate if you crank up resonance all the way. Right, so even if anything isn't coming in the input, you'll get a sine wave tone. You've got keyboard amount control for the filter cutoff, which is important, not only because it lets you play the filter like an oscillator, but because you want to make sure that the cutoff goes up as you play up and down the keyboard. Otherwise, due to the sharp slope, you might not hear notes that are played above the cutoff point. Right, so you do want keyboard tracking, and with a little work you can tune this to track with the keyboard. So for this I'll turn down the oscillator, crank up resonance, right? Then it takes a while. Right, but sort of here is where the filter will track with the keyboard across a few octaves. This will come in handy for a little trick I'll show you later on. Okay, next up are our modulators. You've got 2 envelopes and an LFO, which is also a clock. As the main modulators, like I mentioned before, you can also use oscillator B as a modulation source in the mod matrix. And we use modulators to turn knobs for us. So let's say that I wanted this motion. This filter motion, I would use the filter envelope for that. I'd set a filter modulation amount, otherwise nothing happens, and then turn on the attack, which is the time it takes the filter motion to get to its maximum position based on the envelope amount. Right? So this is the filter opening, right? The attack time is the time it takes to get to the envelope amount level. Then decay is the time it takes it to go back down. Sustain isn't that useful, I think, for filter envelopes, but it's here. This is an intermediate level, and in this case, decay will take the filter cutoff to the sustain level. We'll hear this better with a little bit more resonance. Right, this is the sustain level, and we can play with that. Then release is the time it takes the filter cutoff, in this case, to go down when I leave a key. We won't hear it unless we turn on the VCA release. This is the release of the filter envelope. Personally, for filter envelopes, I typically just use attack and decay, but for either rise style sounds or just quick decays. Right. And indeed, the envelope here is nice and snappy if you need it. So that's the filter envelope amount, filter envelope. And now that we've gone through the filter envelope, the amplifier envelope should be a piece of cake. Same deal, attack, decay, and release are times sustain level is important here. Right, so if we bring things back to normal with the filter, you've got an attack time, which is the time it takes the level to reach its maximum point. Sustain level, which is the level the note is held at, as long as you hold the key, and decay is the time it takes the level to reach the sustain level. And release is the final decay time of the note when you leave the key. Which can get quite long, as you see here. So the envelopes are our 2 one-time modulator, and then we have the LFO, which is a repetitive knob turner or repetitive modulator. So if I wanted this motion, right, this kind of back and forth filter motion, or of any of the other parameters, let's say pulse width, for example, I would choose the LFO shape, which in the case of, say, pulse width modulation, I'd like to be a triangle shape. Now, by default, the LFO isn't connected to anything. You need to use the mod matrix to make that happen, right? So what we're going for is pulse width modulation, which is the back and forth motion, in this case, of the pulse width of oscillator A. So the way to connect the LFO to the pulse width of oscillator A is using the mod matrix. The mod matrix works like this. It's a little bit different from typical mod matrices. It has 2 buses, either a direct bus or route, and a bus or route that goes through the mod wheel. Let's start with the simple one, which is the direct route. I can choose to route any of the 3 sources, either to the direct or to the mod wheel route. All right, let's just choose the LFO for now. And then I choose which of the destinations feed into this direct route. In this case, I want the pulse width of oscillator A, right? So I'll choose direct here, and now these 2 are linked. And then the final ingredient is to set the amount of pulse width modulation. And of course the LFO sets the speed of this repetitive motion. And I could choose any other shape, of course, if I wanted. Or mix the shapes. So the direct bus is one of two buses. I could, by the way, add, let's say, oscillator B, say an LFO mode, to this bus as well, right? And even combine these shapes if I wanted for various rhythmic effects. Right? So that's the direct bus, a combination of any of the sources that have direct selected in them. And then the second bus is just like the direct bus, only it goes through the mod wheel as an additional attenuator or controller. So say, for example, the same LFO fed into pulse width modulation going through the wheel bus, and I'd need to select wheel here, right? Tune into that bus for pulse width. Now, regardless how high I turned up the source here, I'm not going to hear the pulse width modulation, or it's not going to happen until I bring up the mod wheel. Just another example for harsh FM synthesis, I'll use oscillator B in its normal fast mode with keyboard control. In this case, take the direct bus into the frequency of oscillator A, right? And mess with the frequencies. And that's how you get these harsh metallic sounds. And you can get them to track nicely. Right? Sometimes. And you can, of course, tame this both with the filter as well as with the modulation amount. Let's move on to the arpeggiator and sequencer. The arpeggiator is quite simple. It has either an up mode, or an up-down, or Stranger Things mode. The arpeggiator also has a latch function, but it's a little bit different than what you might be used to. So let's go back into this, right? The up and down mode. If you hit record, then the arpeggiator will latch, but now you can't change the chord, you can only add notes to it. So I could add, let's say this note, right? Or these. Or remove notes. But I can't release the original notes. This is the way the original Pro-1 works. Right? So this is how you latch the arpeggiator. Currently, this is the only mode you get, which is cool, but it would have been nice to have a regular latching arpeggiator, which lets you change the entire original chord just by playing a new one. I asked Behringer about this, and they mentioned that with enough demand, they would consider this option for a future firmware update. So if it's important to you, by all means, please demand. Aside from the arpeggiator, Pro-1 also has a sequencer, which lets you store 2 patterns of up to 64 notes each. To record a sequence, you jump into record mode, then choose the sequence you want to overwrite, play the pattern. Right, turn this off, go into play mode, and then when you select the sequence, right, it will just play. You can also insert rests into a sequence. You do that by, let's say, recording a new sequence, going into sequence 2, and then let's say I wanted to add a rest here. You just toggle play and record. During the recording, continue to play the notes. You can add, say, 2 more rests like this, right? And that's how you add rests. Then you stop recording, go into play mode, and this is the sequence with rests. The sequence speed or clock is set by the LFO. And you can use an external clock as well. Let's wrap up this tour by looking at the different modes. Drone mode is pretty simple. Just opens the VCA. You've got control over level using sustain or the main control, but the attack, decay, and release knobs don't do anything. Right? Simple drone mode, so you can play with parameters, say, without holding a key. Then normal or repeat/external. We'll just trigger the gate based on either the LFO or an external source. Right? Here you can set and control the envelope. Normal or retrig determines whether the envelopes will be retriggered when I play in legato, right? So let's take, for example, this filter envelope as I play additional notes in legato. It won't be retriggered, but in retrig mode, it will. The classic function of retrig mode, by the way, was also to choose between low note priority mode and last note priority mode. But you can use the software to change that, as I have, so now I play in last note priority mode regardless of whether I'm in normal or retrig. Then the last mode is mono or poly. Like I said, this isn't about polychaining multiple Pro-1s, but rather about the duophonic mode. Typically, the keyboard will only broadcast one note to both oscillators, right? And both will track together regardless of their interval. If I put it in poly mode, they'll still play the same note if I only send one note to the synth, but if I send it two notes, each will take a different note. The right note will be played by oscillator B, and the left note by oscillator A. Okay, before we move on to the patch ideas section, I'll briefly mention the patch bay, which lets you both rewire some of the internals of the synth as well as connect it with other semi-modular synths or Eurorack gear. The Behringer PRO-1 has additional jacks not found in the original sequential PRO-1, which can come in quite handy, as we'll see in a bit. So a nifty trick is to use the LFO as a simple interval sequencer, right, by setting it to square mode, then choosing the frequency of the interval that I want, as well as the interval itself, using the amount knob, the LFO amount knob. And for this to work, I need to route it, right, to the direct bus and to the frequency of either oscillator A or B or both. Now, the LFO makes tuning easy on us because it's not bipolar. Right, so we've got the C going here on the bottom, and then depending on how picky we want to be, we now have a simple sort of pattern arpeggiator that will transpose as we play along, and we can assign this to both oscillators or just to one of them if we want. Right? Now, what's slightly annoying about this, as you may have noticed, is that because the LFO is free running, I don't get a consistent pattern every time I hit a note. A little trick to get around that is just by turning on the arpeggiator, which syncs the LFO or clock to the key press, right? So now I'll get a consistent rhythm every time I hit a key. This is a neat trick to use the LFO as sort of like an envelope or a looping envelope. So if I just turn this off for a bit, turn on, say, a triangle wave shape, then disconnect the oscillator frequencies and say connect the LFO to the filter, right? I can get an envelope that's in sync with key presses, and then maybe use the filter envelope using the patch bay for something else, which I'll show you in a bit. Let's move back for a second to our alternating octaves. Now, to kick this trick up a notch, I can use it in duophonic mode to have, say, oscillator A play the pattern, right, be routed through the mod matrix, but not do that for oscillator B and just play any melody that I wanted, right, with oscillator B. Another neat trick or thing that I noticed is that glide only works for oscillator A in duophonic mode, and we can use this to our advantage, right? So say play without glide here, right? And have the bassline glide. Another neat trick is to use the extreme pulse width modulation for rhythmic results, right? So I'll turn off the pattern, but point the LFO to pulse width. If I go to the extreme here, right, you can get these rhythmic results, right, using pulse width at an extreme starting point. This, by the way, has a different sound depending on which starting point you choose. If you go to the other extreme, it's a bit thinner and harsher. Next up, I mentioned before you could play the filter's resonance as a third oscillator, but I think a more interesting use for this is to crank up resonance a bit, especially with a sawtooth wave, and pick off individual harmonics. Let's say, right, this is a G above my root note, right? And if I've got this set right, the keyboard amount set right, I'll get this interval regardless of where I play. So I could choose to emphasize right, this harmonic or any other one. This one's nice. And you kind of get these organ-like sounds, right? This is my original sawtooth, okay? Filtered, of course. This is with that second harmonic. I could, of course, bring in oscillator B at any other interval that I like. So this is a nice way to create unique sounds in sort of chord-like shapes. Now, the filter envelope isn't of use to us here, right? Because we don't want to move the cutoff frequency. That will impact the resonance, but maybe we can use it for something else. So Pro-1 comes with a couple patch cables. I can take the filter envelope out, right, and patch that into the CV controlling the resonance. So now I can bring up this additional tone with this envelope. So this is the original chord shape here without resonance. I can gradually, right, bring the resonance up. Just makes for a really interesting sound design tool, I think. Okay, next up is what is probably the oldest trick in the book, and that is patching the audio out back in to the mixer using the external input. So, and I'm going to turn the level down here. This is our original sound. And with gradually adding feedback, right, we can change it and further, right, distort it. This is really nice with, say, a reverb effect. So it gets a bit too much over here, but just these little additions here, right, give this a totally new and gritty sound. Let's move on. Unlike other synths, Pro-1 doesn't have a fade-in option for the LFO, right? If we want to just gradually bring in the LFO rather than have it kick in all at once. So let's say, for example, that I wanted the LFO to gradually fade in. Like this, right? This one-time motion can happen with envelopes, but there's no way to control this knob, right? There's no CV input for the amount here. However, there is a mod wheel CV input here. So I can control the mod depth amount either with the amp envelope or the filter envelope. Let's take the filter envelope, plug that into the mod wheel CV input, right? And make sure that my LFO is going through the mod wheel bus and that the filter is listening in on the mod wheel bus. So now this knob by itself won't do anything, right? It can with the mod wheel, but we want this motion to happen automatically, and we'll use the filter envelope for that, right? Choose an attack, right? Make it long and nice, and the decay long and nice. So now every time we press a key, it triggers the filter envelope, which increases the LFO amount, then takes it back down, right? And this works for anything. So say for harsh FM sounds, let's hook up oscillator B, right, into this bus as well, and have oscillator A listen into it. Now our sound can get progressively crazy, and then back to normal. And of course I could change this any way I wanted, right? So I can have just a sharp, crazy little start, right? Then have it go back to normal. Another thing I like to try is always push parameters beyond what the knob will let us. Let's take, for example, the LFO output, right? And plug that into our external input and take a listen to it, okay? So this is the LFO, right? And it gets into very low audio rates. I could choose, obviously, any shape I wanted, right? But it doesn't go much higher than this. However, we can use the LFO as a third or fourth oscillator if you count the filter, if we push it up beyond what the knob will allow. One way to do that is with a keyboard CV, right? Back into the LFO CV input. Let's turn down oscillator A. So all we're hearing now is the LFO, right? Remember, before it couldn't get into audio rates. Now it's clearly doing it. Now, unfortunately, this won't track at volt per octave. Right? This range is a little bit less than an octave. So unless you're into microtonal playing, this won't function exactly as an oscillator that you can play through the keyboard. You can, however, sequence the LFO CV using an external sequencer that sends out CV levels and tune each level to any pattern you like. Another option would just be to use the LFO as a drone, either connect a constant CV to it, or if I go into drone mode, nice little trick you might want to try, connect the amp envelope output to the LFO CV, right? And then use this to set the LFO at a specific frequency. Yeah, the LFO does come in pretty hot, right? So you need to make sure you're not taking it up too much here. But yeah, you can use it. As a third oscillator. Okay, so what are the pros and cons? I think that in the case of Pro-1, its pros and cons are the same thing, meaning this is a simple, clearly laid out knob per function synth. It means that if you're looking for bells and whistles and complex patching, you won't find many compared to, say, the Neutron, though the filters are different, or other digital synths from other companies at the same price range. Another con is that the arpeggiator and sequencer require an external keyboard to be programmed. You can store two sequences on board and launch them without a keyboard, but you really want some sort of MIDI keyboard along with this. Like I mentioned, the arpeggiator doesn't latch chords the way that most modern arpeggiators do. It would be nice if in a future update there would be an option to have both the original arpeggiator as well as a modern one that lets you swap chords. On the pros side, like I said before, the interface is clearly laid out and easy to use, and most importantly, Pro-1 just sounds good. It's got deep bass if you want it, but also squelchy and sharp tones if you need them, and the additional duophonic mode and patch bay jacks mean that Pro-1 is open to quite a few creative options. Speaking of creative options, if you want plenty more tips and patch ideas like the ones in this video, please check out my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Feel free to ask me anything or leave your pros and cons in the comment section below. Hit like if this was useful, ring the subscribe bell if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks so much for watching.